Our next panelist is Judge West. Again, Judge West started out her legal career working in the Commonwealth Attorney's Office, and I'll tell you it was a hard tour of duty because she specialized in cases involving child neglect and abuse, and those are the heartbreaking cases. Her legal experience has taken her through the full continuum of law enforcement in the sense that she's worked for Commonwealth Attorney's Office, but she's also worked for the State Attorney General's Office. She's worked at state level with agencies that work on juvenile justice issues. We are so pleased to have her here at Regent University School of Law, where she teaches the juvenile law course and keeps all of us on our toes and helps us remember that even as grown-ups, it's always helpful if you mind your P's and Q's. So without further ado.
Judge Blow responded to that email because I need someone else who may not be politically correct up here because I say things that I think are common sense but aren't always politically correct. And Judge Blow and I started out in the city attorney's office where I did civil child abuse and neglect cases, and that's where I really fell in love with that area of the law. And I know that sounds weird, but helping kids is what it is, and it was an ugly area, but it was also a very rewarding area. So I went to the prosecutor's office to prosecute those cases, but as a side effect, a side product of that, a byproduct of that, I had to also prosecute juveniles who committed offenses because we had to prosecute everything that started in juvenile court, and so that's how I ended up involved in the juvenile justice system. So as a prosecutor in the early 90s, I prosecuted in Virginia Beach and then went to Norfolk, where I was the deputy of the juvenile team. And it was in Norfolk that I coined the term FFF, first felonies free. This was before the juvenile justice reform. This was before 14-year-olds could be transferred. This was when defense attorneys would come up to you and say, "This is his first felony. You're just going to give me unsupervised probation, right?" And I'm like, no, I don't think so. I think that there ought to be a consequence for a felonious act. Maybe it shouldn't be going to detention, and it wouldn't be going to detention, but there needed to be a tangible consequence for this act. If you put someone on a deferred finding and gave them unsupervised probation, they walked out of that courtroom at that age thinking they got away with it, and we reinforced negative behavior. And I was very frustrated with that system. And just like Ms. Bryant said, she had a 14-year-old that she had to transfer or that hurt her. I had a 14-year-old that I couldn't transfer. And I think that that's where I got my fire in the belly, if you will, about the juvenile justice system and the need for change. I had a 14-year-old who was sitting on a street corner, just hanging out there, and a 17-year-old young man who literally, I'm not making this up to make it, I'm not taking poetic license with this, walking home from church, from his praise band practice, carrying his guitar, who just looked over at the kid, and the boy shot and killed him because he did not like the way he looked at him. I mean, that was what he told the police officer. And so I had a 17-year-old whose life was cut short by a 14-year-old who had to stay in juvenile court, so the maximum punishment that he could get would be commitment to 21, and even that was going to be, it could vary a little bit. And and it wasn't just that he had done this act, it was that when he came into the courtroom, he was blank. There was no emotion. We tried the case, he was convicted, and he turned around. The mother of the victim was screaming and crying in the background, and he turned around and gave his mother a thumbs up. And he was led out to the Department of Juvenile Justice as a juvenile. So that's why I felt compelled to go to Richmond when I was asked and to be the Department of what was called the Department of Youth and Family Services, which I thought sounded too much like a social services agency, and I really felt like we needed to focus on the aspect of criminal justice. This is a criminal justice agency. So we needed to make it a criminal justice agency. They were called, the juvenile correctional centers were called learning centers. That's like where you send your 3-year-old to a learning center. So we changed the name of that too, because it should fit. You should know what is going to happen. You should know that you've done something wrong. And so I have to say that I'm one of the ones who believe that there are consequences for actions, and they should be appropriate consequences. Now, having said that, I want to defend the Department of Juvenile Justice and the Juvenile Justice Reform of 1996, because what we were trying to do, and this never got reported, I was like Attila the Hun. I met people and they said, we thought you would be like 6 foot tall and 300 pounds, you know, because you sound so, you're portrayed so negatively in the press and like this mean person. What our goal was, and what I think that we accomplished at that time, and I think that it devolved after, through various directors later on and through various things that happened politically, as things do, was to make sure that we got the juveniles out of the juvenile justice system who were least likely to benefit from the services that were being offered. What we were finding was that the kids who were being committed, who had committed the most violent offenses, were taking up an inordinate amount of the limited resources that were available. So we wanted to make sure that the kids who got out of the system, who committed the worst crimes, who were least likely to be able to benefit from that, were out of the system, and then we could focus and provide services, and we provided a lot of services to the juveniles who were left, who went to the juvenile justice centers. It was under the Allen administration that juveniles stopped getting GEDs, but we turned the high schools into actual high schools where you could get a diploma, and they had a name. They had a name that was not Beaumont High School. It was named after someone, so that when you went to work for someone, you could say, I graduated from, George Washington High School, whatever we named the high schools. So we tried to do that. We tried to increase the services that were available in counseling. We tried to work with the kids who were left in the system and get the ones who were causing all the trouble out of the system. And so I still defend that. I still think that that is a reasonable way to go. I may not get any applause after this. I may be politically incorrect. I don't know. But I think it's common sense. All of the movement back towards, let's get, let's not do these things. Let's not lock up so many kids. It's counterintuitive to me. The crime rate was going up in the 90s. We responded. The crime rate has gone down. Okay, so the result is let's lighten up on what we're doing, or let's change what we're doing. To me, it's a cause and effect. I don't know. I may not have the statistics to back it up. I'm a common sense kind of person, and I just look at what's going on. I also want to bring up, we've all talked about the juveniles involved in the system. As a prosecutor, I was involved with the victims. It did not matter to someone who was the victim of a violent crime whether the person who committed that crime was 14 or 40. They were still victimized, they still had been violated, and they still wanted justice. Now, do I think that a lot of these kids had problems? Absolutely. Did my heart break for them? Absolutely. I've locked up parents when I was a judge in juvenile court. My favorite example was I had a kid who was, I was just going to lock him up for the weekend. I think that you need to have immediate consequences, maybe, not very severe, but just get their attention, So I was going to lock this kid up for a weekend, and he was not the typical kid who came in there. He came from a very privileged background, went to, Cox High School, and, thought he was all that. So he was going to be in the local detention home for the weekend. He was in the back in lockup, and his mom came back in a few minutes later, and she goes, Judge West, we're supposed to go to a funeral this weekend, and it's someone that is really close to, my son was close to, And I said, well, why didn't you tell me beforehand? And she's like, well, I just was so scared and I didn't think of it. I said, okay, well, go sit out in the hall. I'm going to let him cool his heels back there for a while, and then I'll reconsider this, because I was going to maybe let her take him to the funeral. So he starts making noise in the back. He starts banging on the walls. So I tell my bailiff, bring him out here. So he brings him out, and I tell him that he needs to, calm down from being in the back. And then just, I don't know what made me do this, but I said, and by the way, who passed away? And he goes, passed away? I said, aren't you going to a funeral this weekend? He goes, we're going to a wedding.
Well, it's a funeral in some people's minds. Yeah.
And so I locked Mom up for the weekend for lying to me. I mean, and this was a mother, this was someone who's a soccer mom who drives the BMW, who, that's all she needed was a weekend in jail. She learned her lesson. So, and that's not the typical parent that we get. We get a lot of parents who have a lot of problems, but yes, these kids are affected by their parents, and they are, maybe don't have the best circumstances, and a lot of them have terrible and very depressing circumstances. But again, I think we do a disservice by reinforcing negative behavior, by not showing them that there are consequences for their bad behavior, because I went from juvenile court to circuit court, and I've actually had people in circuit court say, well, nothing ever happened to me in juvenile court. And I could see their defense attorneys shrink, because they knew my philosophy, and then that just reinforced my belief that, of course, we had to be doing more in juvenile court and addressing things initially. Maybe it's picking up trash on the side of the road. I mean, I'm not talking about locking everyone up the first time they come in. I'm just talking about something that is concrete, that a 14-year-old or a 12-year-old mind can see as a consequence for their behavior. And hopefully that will prevent some of the further behaviors. Maybe not. I mean, they come from terrible places. One of my regrets is that even though we got most of what we wanted in juvenile justice, we did not get enough of the halfway houses, because it's best to send kids back to a different environment. I mean, no matter what we do with them at the correctional center, if we send them back home to the neighborhood to all their friends, it's hard for them to, even if they learn something at the juvenile correctional center, it's hard for them to stay out of trouble. The strong ones do, but it's a lot of pressure. Anyway, I have tons of things that I could talk about, but as Judge Blow said, I'll just defer and let some other